This video will cover the cardiovascular disease part of Unit 2. It's the second last topic in this unit. So there'll be a few videos on this, mainly because there's quite a lot of content in it. So the initial one I'll talk about is involving just atherosclerosis in general and the atheromas that will then lead on to other cardiovascular diseases. So firstly, you need to know what an atheroma is, and it's sometimes referred to as a plaque. So atheromas are generally linked to all the different types of cardiovascular disease that we've talked about just in class. So angina is chest pain, heart attacks are something called myocardial infarctions or MIs, strokes are to do with the brain, and then peripheral vascular disease will be to do with the blood vessels that supply the legs and the arms. So atheromas consist of three things, so fatty material, which is mainly cholesterol, fibrous material, and then calcium, which makes the atheroma quite hard. So this is a diagram here of an artery. Now in an artery you should be able to label parts of these. So the connective tissue and the elastic fibres and the muscle tissue would be all this area in here. But we're not going to label that just now, we're mainly going to label the parts that are affected by an atheroma. So what I've got here labelled is an atheroma or a plaque. Now if you look at the particular place that this atheroma has formed, it's formed beneath the endothelium. So that inner layer that lines the artery is the endothelium. So atheromas specifically form beneath that endothelium, so underneath the endothelium, between that and the muscular layer which is surrounding it. So you need to know the exact location of an atheroma, which is beneath the endothelium, and specifically of an artery. So generally when we talk about cardiovascular disease, it is typically in an artery. There's only one example where that's not the case. So the effect of this then is that artery grows. Generally it gets bigger, which is why you get this bulge here, and it thickens. And because it's encroaching on this elastic area with the muscle fibres here, it loses its elasticity, so it doesn't ping back as much. So it becomes brittle. Now if you look at the lumen here, which is this area where the blood flows through, that lumen's supposed to be wide enough to allow blood to flow through, but with an atheroma, it then decreases the diameter of that. So it becomes narrower and narrower. Right? So because of that then, and because the diameter of that lumen is reduced, then the blood flow is restricted, and therefore blood pressure increases. So this is very generally about atheromas, but atheromas can cause a whole bunch of other problems. So before I move on and show you those other problems, I'm just going to highlight the key parts. So endothelium of an artery is exactly where that forms. Okay, it loses elasticity, and because the diameter of that lumen is reduced, blood pressure will increase. Now an atheroma forms in an artery beneath that endothelium, and it can lead to damage to those blood vessels that it's involved in. Okay, so damage to the artery. So that's where we get what's called thrombosis occurring. So a thrombosis is generally the term for the formation of a clot. So what we've got here in this diagram is an artery. So with its thick muscular wall, and then this here is the endothelium. Now this area here is an atheroma, again forming beneath the endothelium of an artery. Now the issue with this is that if an atheroma ruptures and it bursts through here, it will damage that endothelium. Okay, so when it damages that endothelium, it releases clotting factors which will try and clot this area and seal this wound. So I've written down these points, so I'm going to go through these step by step. So when those clotting factors are released, they then cause a cascade of reactions to happen. Okay, so the atheroma ruptures and it damages the endothelium. So you want to be specific about exactly where this occurs. So endothelium would be underlined in a marking instruction for an essay question. So clotting factors are released, and that will then cause a reaction to happen, or a cascade of reactions to happen. Now that results in the conversion of a protein in the plasma, which will be floating about in this plasma here, which is the blood, the liquid part of the blood. It causes a conversion of what's called prothrombin which is an inactive form of that plasma protein, into an active version called thrombin. Now the reason it's not active all the time is because then that would cause your blood to clot all the time. Okay, so you have an inactive version of prothrombin that then when there's damage occurred here, it would then cause it to be converted into thrombin. Now thrombin causes the next part to happen. So thrombin causes fibrinogen, which again is another plasma protein, to form threads of fibrin. Okay, so prothrombin initially converts to thrombin. Thrombin then causes fibrinogen to form fibrin threads. So this is quite a challenging part because there's quite a lot of different terms in this, which is why if it's an essay question, people tend to struggle with it. So the fibrin threads do a bunch of different things. So at the site of this atheroma, where that's burst through, the fibrin threads will try to start forming a meshwork. Okay, which will try to seal that wound. So these threads will stick to that area. Okay, so a meshwork forms. And it will clot the blood. Now when that blood clots, it is called a thrombus. And as shown in that diagram that just drawn, it seals the wound over. So it prevents that from continuing to then burst and rupture. And then it provides scaffolding for scar tissue to seal that whole area and to heal it essentially. Okay, so it clots the blood, seals the wound, and it provides scaffolding for scar tissue. Now what you'll then see in a diagram often is a large clot forming. The red blood cells and platelets and things like that that are in the blood will stick to that and it'll form a large clot called a thrombus. So if you see a collection like that, this would be a thrombus. Okay, which is just the term for a clot. And the formation of a thrombus is called a thrombosis. Okay, so the next issue with that is then that the blood flow that would be coming through here can be, if not restricted, then completely blocked. Now if it blocks a blood vessel, that prevents oxygen and, well, oxygenated blood from getting to the area that this artery supplies. So the problem is that then that deprives the tissues of oxygen and therefore that tissue dies. Okay, so blood supply is not enough and therefore those tissues die because they don't have sufficient oxygen. Now the reason I've got diagrams down here is because they can affect particular parts of your body and then lead to more issues. So this would be a brain. In the diagram of the brain, this would be an artery that supplies this area of the brain over here. Okay, so if there's an atheroma in the artery that supplies the brain, or part of the brain, and there's a blockage there, and then a thrombus forms from this when it bursts and needs to clot and seal, what happens is all the area that supplies this, or has been supplied by this artery, does not get enough oxygen and it dies off. Okay, so that would be described as a stroke. Now if the same thing happens in a coronary artery in the heart, so this is the heart here, I should probably label that the brain, and this would be a coronary artery. So if there's a blockage in one of these arteries here due to a thrombus, then the whole area below this, where that tissues should be supplied with oxygenated blood, is not. So that area dies and that would cause a heart attack, or what's known as a myocardial infarction. So you can simply call that a heart attack, but if they refer to it as a myocardial infarction, that's what that means. Now one of the other issues with this, because there's not enough already, is that this thrombus may actually break off a part of it. So a section of it may become loose and break free of that original thrombus. Now when that part of it breaks off, it is known as an embolus. So the formation of an embolus is known as an embolism. So when it breaks loose, it's called an embolus. Okay, and the problem with that is that it will not block this size of blood vessel, but it will block a smaller one later on, so it will travel around the body and will eventually block a smaller blood vessel. So an embolus is essentially a travelling clot. So thrombosis and then embolisms or an emboli, is at least two of the examples of issues that form from atheromas. There are further ones, so these will be essentially relating to the heart and the blood vessel supply in the brain, but there are other ones that would supply then the heart and, or not the heart, sorry, but the arms and the legs, so the limbs. So that would be referred to as peripheral vascular disease, which is what I'm going to move on to next. So peripheral vascular disease is the narrowing of the arteries that supply the limbs, and that's due to atherosclerosis. So when this occurs, it can lead to restriction of blood flow. So if blood flow is restricted, then oxygen is restricted to those tissues. Now when oxygen is decreased to those tissues, that leads to pain. And it would typically be pain in the limbs. Okay, due to the muscles lacking in oxygen. Okay, so a deep vein thrombosis then is an example of peripheral vascular disease. So a deep vein thrombosis is one of the only examples, or the only example that will refer to veins and not arteries. So all the previous examples we talked about are in arteries alone, but this one will be a vein specifically. So if you break it down in terms of what it means, thrombosis is a clot, and it's a clot that forms in a deep vein. Now specifically that clot will form in a deep vein, not in the heart or in the artery supplying the brain, but in the limbs. So a deep vein in the limbs, and particularly it's normally affecting the legs. Okay, so the issue is then this would be your thrombus, your thrombosis, your formation of that. The issue with this is then typically like before, you can then have a section of that break off and that would form an embolus. Okay, so if it breaks loose, it forms an embolus. Now the issue with this is that when that embolus travels, it can then reach the lungs and block a pulmonary artery. Now when that pulmonary artery is blocked, that is called a pulmonary embolism. Now, pulmonary embolism, then the issue with that is if you're not getting enough, or if you have a blockage in that artery, that leads to blood not going through into the lungs, and therefore no oxygen being picked up by the blood, and therefore it will typically lead to either chest pain if it's not a serious blockage, difficulty breathing, or in extreme cases, it can actually lead to just sudden death because there's not sufficient blood getting through into the lungs, and therefore not sufficient oxygen getting to the blood. So in a diagram, this would be a deep vein thrombosis. So you can tell it's a deep vein thrombosis because this would be a valve, and therefore this is a vein. And it would often show you a part of that clot breaking off, and that would be your embolism here, or your embolus. Okay, so these are, just to review the points here, we've got narrowing of arteries that supply the limbs. Okay, so not the ones referring to the heart and the brain, just the ones that supply the limbs. Okay, and that's due to atherosclerosis. So blood flow is reduced or restricted, there's less oxygen getting to those areas, and it will cause pain in the limbs, particularly the muscles, because the muscles lack in oxygen. So an example, and the only one that we really talk about for peripheral vascular disease, it would be deep vein thrombosis, so DVTs. So when that clot forms in a deep vein in the legs, it can break loose and form a pulmonary embolism when it reaches the pulmonary artery. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to move on to the next section then, which will be to do with cholesterol.